Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of March of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First, let's start with the Kupiansk front line. The Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours they continued their offensive operation in the vicinity of Kupiansk. They were attacking the Ukrainians in direction of Mosykovka, Liman I. They were trying to complete the clearing operation of this forest. The Russians were attacking Sinkovka, the Russians were attacking in direction of Kislovka, the Russians were attacking in the vicinity of Nevskaya, and as a result of all these battles, some of them were just regular echoing combos, some of them was a real offensive directions and so on, and as a result of that, those clashes, the Ukrainians lost 75 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 4 artillery systems Gvozdyka. As you can see, the level of Ukrainian losses has been increased. That means that the Russians, maybe after some period of regrouping, took a decision to increase the pressure. Furthermore, the Western and the Ukrainian sources are saying that one of the most powerful Russian army, is deployed on the Kupiansk front line. Not the Wagners, but exactly on the Kupiansk front line. So that means that the main attack haven't been started yet from the Russian side, because if you try to keep some powerful forces some certain front line, that means that you're going to use this powerful army as the main direction of attack. But for now, this army is still on its position, so let's wait a little bit, and I believe that soon they are going to start. Now let's go to the Liman front line. The Russians continue their offensive operation in direction of Kremenная forest, trying to push the Ukrainians to step from this bank of the river in direction of Serebryanka. Furthermore, the Russians, as you can see, are trying to encircle the Ukrainians in this small salient. The Ukrainians, let's take a look at the Western Russian sources map. As you can see, the Ukrainians established their fortification on the west from Chervonopopovka in this forest, and they managed to establish some secure roads to supply and support this army. And now this is a very big problem for the Russians, and the only possible solution for the Russians is to encircle this area and to attack this area from the south and from the north. Furthermore, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes during the previous days, they managed to develop a little bit their bridgehead from this salient to the north in direction of Terny and Yampolovka. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 95 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems in this area. The Ukrainians lost Akatsi, D-30 and M777 howitzer. As you can see, the level of losses of Ukrainians on this side, on this front line, has been reduced. So maybe that means that when talking about this front line, the Russians took a decision to slow down, maybe to make some kind of regrouping, and after that I believe they will restore the pressure, and they need, according to timings, to return control over this territory as fast as possible. Now let's talk about Bakhmut. As you can see, there are a lot of clashes all over the front line. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the main clashes were in the vicinity of Zelezyanskaya. The Russians are trying to penetrate this area. The Russians were attacking in the direction of Ivanovskaya, trying to pin down and freeze the Ukrainians and to cut the road N32 that connects Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. We know this situation, but the most important and interesting part is this small salient. As we discussed yesterday, this is the main area that the Ukrainians were using for their tanks brigades and mechanized parts, tank parts of mechanized brigades. If you take a look at deployment map, you're gonna see that when talking about this area, there are at least 2 tanks brigade. I'm not saying that they're completely concentrated there. No, I'm not saying this, but we understand that these fields is the main salient that those brigades were accumulated before, let's say, greatest offensive operation, or not even before offensive operation. They were accumulated there, collected there for purpose not to allow the Russians to penetrate this area. And now, according to the nature, to the ground, to the natural barriers, we see that the Ukrainian parts in this area are stuck, because it's very difficult, at least now, for them to evacuate from these areas. We discussed there are a lot of natural barriers, there are fields that are very difficult to cross, and they're just one possible way for evacuation through the small town Bandarne, and these tank parts are encircled in this area and got trapped. So this is the reason why the Russians want to take control over Zelezhnyanskaya, and if they are able to do this, let's say to develop this bridgehead with this blue cloud. After this moment, they will be able to attack every single tank, every single part in this small bag, and the level of Ukrainian losses will be increased. So this is the first thing. And another thing, that using this natural barrier, the Russians managed to split the Ukrainian army on this bridgehead. So for now, there are at least 3 Ukrainian parts, 3 parts in this area. Let's say this back is the first part. Now this let's little bit split. So the area between Mosykovka and this river is the first Ukrainian part, and mainly there are tank brigades in this area and mechanized parts. The second part is the territory between Minkovka and Privilya. There is the area where the Ukrainians established their headquarters, main positions, and it's like the focal point for them, not to allow the Russians to penetrate this area. And let's say the southern part that started at Orekhovo-Vasilievka and ends somewhere at Grigorievka. So these are 3 parts. This is the thing that the Russians managed to do. First, to split the Ukrainian army into 3 separate parts. It allows them to manipulate, it allows them to be flexible and mobile, and of course it helps them, and the situation completely works in their favor. And they're pushing the Ukrainians back from this area, and I believe that maybe within even by the end of this week, the Russians will be able to establish control over Orekhovo-Vasilieva, and by that, and Zaliznyansko, of course, and by these 2 attacks, they will improve their position, and maybe they will force the Ukrainians to step back from this area. Because, today there was some kind of meeting among the general staff of Ukraine, and they took a decision to continue defense operation of Bakhmut. You need to understand one important thing. Of course, we discussed a lot that Ukrainian forces are stuck in Bakhmut. We understand this, but when the general staff of Ukraine told us that they took a decision to continue defense of Bakhmut, and the thing is not about the fact that the forces in Bakhmut are collapsed or not collapsed, are trapped and blockade, and they can't evacuate from this town. The thing is that, as you can see, according to the configuration of the front line, the Russians took a decision to change their focus. Now just imagine yourself, so Bakhmut, the square of Bakhmut and the square of the bridgehead on the north. If we are talking about the facts, we see that the Russians changed their focus, and they're trying to push in direction of Slaviansk, trying to get as close as possible to the channel and to secure their flanks before the Ukrainians start their own deblocking operation of Bakhmut. When talking about Bakhmut, of course, the Russians, they didn't leave this town. Of course, they continue storming operation from the north, they continue pushing from the south, and they're trying to force the Ukrainians to leave the central part of Bakhmut in direction of the, eastern part of Bakhmut. But for now, there are just small progress on the north. The Russians established control over some parts of this industrial zone. Furthermore, some Russian sources are saying that as a result of penetrate operation on the north, they managed to encircle a small group of Ukrainians with 500 soldiers. It's very difficult to determine where exactly they managed to encircle them. If you remember, we discussed yesterday that there are very heavy clashes also on the underground levels of this industrial zone, so maybe they are stuck somewhere on the ground. Who knows? But as you can see, the progress is very slow, because the attacks in direction of central part is not the main attacks. So the Russians are trying to develop, if it's possible, to attack where is the weakest position, but without any panic or without any. They're not trying to hurry up in this situation. The most important is to develop the bridgehead on the north and on the south. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 150 soldiers, 11 armored vehicles, and 5 artillery systems. Furthermore, the Ukrainians lost 3 tanks during the battle for Donetsk front line. As you can see, the level of losses among tanks has been increased. And I believe that mainly this situation is connected with the clashes exactly on the northern front line, where the Ukrainians have their main tank parts and so on. So we'll see. We need to follow these numbers about the losses of tanks on this front line, because tanks is the main forces, the main power that Ukrainians are able to use to deblocate, to release and to free Bakhmut from the Russian attacks from the north. And today the Ukrainians lost 3 tanks. Yesterday the Ukrainians lost just 19 armored vehicles, and the day before they haven't lost anything. So that's like the first day when the Ukrainians, since the beginning of this week, it's the first day when the Ukrainians lost tanks on Donetsk front line. But now this is the most important number. Now let's move to Avdiivka front line. As you can see, there are also a lot of changes on the ground. As you can see, the Western sources map has been updated. Now we see that the Russians have progress in the direction of Toninka. The Russians Ministry of Defense included this town, I believe, for another time in a row, second or third or fourth time in a row. So this town is very important, and the Russians are trying to attack this area from many directions, and they need to develop this bridgehead from the south. And if they're able to take these 2 towns like Severna and Toninka, the Russians will be able to establish, I believe, a real operational encirclement of Avdiivka, because from that moment they will establish fire control over the roads, and this is going to be the beginning of the end of Avdiivka story. Furthermore, as you can see, the Russians' bridgehead has been developed in the vicinity of Nevska. Now, according to this map, we see that the Russians establish at least fire or even physical control over the only roads that connects Nivoyska. And if this information is not kind of speculation, I believe that maybe even by the end of this week we're going to see that Nivoyska is going to fall, and Nivoyska is going to be taken by the Russians, because there is only one road, and this road is under fire or very close to physical control. When talking about Marinka, there are no changes. The Russians continue their storming of Pobeda, trying to encircle Marinka from both sides, from the south and from the north, but without any progress, as you can see. When talking about the South Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 60 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system D-20, but without any changes on the ground. And now let's discuss about Kherson. The Russians reported that as a result of artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost 40 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, and 3 artillery systems in this area, but also without any changes on the ground. Now let's return one more time to Donetsk front line, and I would like to discuss with you one important thing that I have mentioned. First of all, if you take a look at the front line from Pobeda to let's say Pervomaiska, you see that the front line is almost looks like a strict line. So you see that there is a small salient from the Russian start. The base of this salient starts of Novomikhailovka from the south, let's say, and it starts somewhere at Vadiana from the north. And then there is a small back salient of Russian bridgehead, and it looks like a very strict line. You see this, right? And now then we see another salient from the Russian side that starts at Krasnogorovka and ends in the south of New York, this one. And as you can see, we can make a line between these 2 areas, and it looks like a part of parts of one big plan. You see this. So now I understand that when talking about Donetsk and this front line, at least in the vicinity of Donetsk, the Russians' main goal is to create a buffer and to push the Ukrainians almost on the same level as far as possible from this town. You see this. So there is like a strict line that starts at the south of New York and ends somewhere at Pobeda, and Marinka includes Marinka. Furthermore, if we try to develop this line, we're gonna see that the real original plan, Russian plan, was to not just to create this small buffer between DPR capital and Ukrainian territory under Ukrainian control. Furthermore, as you can see, the Russians were trying during the previous months to take control over Ugledar as well, and the Ugledar is also a part of Russian plans, so that at least used to be. I am not sure that the Russians are not going to start this plan one more time to repeat the attempt, but we see that this is like the original plan of the Russians, from Ugledar to Novomikhailovka to Novobakhmutovka, to create a barrier in 10 kilometers from the original positions in direction of Ukrainian positions. So, and this is not just a plan to create a barrier, this is also a perfect bridgehead before possible upcoming greatest offensive operation from the Russian side. And there are a lot of reasons why the Russians, we talk a lot about Russian operation from the south, from direction of Zaporozhye, from direction of, let's say, Mariupol, or offensive operation from Kupiansk and Liman. But the weak side of those plans is that if the Russians take a decision to start this greatest offensive operation, first they need to bring forces on these front lines. And of course, this will be spotted and discovered by the Ukrainians immediately, because for these purposes, they will be forced to deploy their forces somewhere in the fields and so on. But when we're talking about Donetsk, Donetsk is the perfect position where the Ukrainians are able to hide, the Russians, where the Russians are able to hide their weapon, armored vehicles, tanks, and so on, because this is the city. There are a lot of places, there are a lot of mines. It's like coal town. The main industry is the coal mining, so there are a lot of places underground, a lot of places where the Russians are able to hide a lot of weapon. And it's as soon as the Russians are able to develop this bridgehead, starting from, let's say, from the north at Novobakhmutovka and ending somewhere at Ugledar, this will be perfect strict line for perfect broad frontline attack all over the front line in this area, so in this direction. So possibly this is exactly the area that the Russians are going to use before upcoming greatest offensive operation. And anyway, they need to do this because, as we discussed, the Russians changed their tactic. Now they're not attacking and storming the Ukrainian towns in front. They're trying to encircle. And if they want to establish control over New York, Donetsk, Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, they need to attack this area from the south. And for these purposes, they need to start movements from Donetsk. And this is exactly the reason why the Russians activated in the vicinity of Avdiivka, because everything is according to timings, and they're not going to count their resources, but they will take Avdiivka within the next few months. This is a must situation for them. Without Avdiivka, this plan, the Russians are not able to implement this plan. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.